Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mukund Dhar, and I'm a partner in the Project Development and Project Finance Department of White & Case. I'm based in White & Case's London office. Just to give you some quick background, I'm an energy lawyer, and I have worked on a number of oil and gas and power transactions across emerging markets, and in particular in Africa. And I am delighted to have you join us today to discuss LNG to power in the context of Africa and discuss specific issues and considerations to keep in mind when structuring these projects, but also from a bankability perspective to make these projects happen. You will see from your screen that there is the ability to send through questions and, in fact, comments as the presentation progresses. Please do so. It is always good to have an interactive session. I have already received about 10 or 12 questions, which I will try and answer. And if there are any other questions you have as we go through this presentation, please do submit them, and we will try our best to deal with them. The plan for the presentation today is to spend about 40 minutes talking about two main areas. One is setting the scene about discussing LNG to power, discussing it in the context of doing projects in Africa. And the second part of the presentation is talking about specific issues in more detail. Now, the idea is not to do the classic completion risk, market risk, credit risks kind of analysis, but really to examine some of these issues based on our experience with doing projects like this across the world and similar, although not identical, projects in emerging markets, to try and look at certain themes that have emerged and how they can help us in designing better projects which have a greater chance of success, successful financial close and indeed operations. I hope to spend about 40 minutes setting the scene and talking about these key issues, and about 20 minutes taking questions as well as answering the questions which I have already received. So please send questions and comments through as we go through this presentation. We have a wide variety of participants in this webinar, and so I wanted to spend 1 or 2 quick minutes talking about LNG to power generally and what it looks like. And what you will see from the screen in front of you is the chain in terms of gas flows, LNG flows, and power flows, all the way from gas production on the left through liquefaction on the top or through pipelines in the middle, reaching customers. On the top, where it is liquefied, you have LNG carriers that bring the LNG to a regasification terminal. There are 2 primary kinds of terminal indicated on this diagram, an onshore terminal as well as a floating storage and regasification unit. Although for people who are familiar with these projects, there are, of course, a number of variants in betweens, partly onshore, partly offshore, floating storage versus onshore regasification, or complete floating storage and regasification, etc. As you follow the chain of LNG and gas through, it is ultimately transported through a pipeline through power plants, and from power plants into the transmission and distribution system, and ultimately to customers. What we want to focus on is the idea of taking LNG and converting it into power, not necessarily gas to power, which for reasons we will discuss is a very different proposition. Before we start, I think it is helpful to talk about broad structures which the industry has seen when it comes to LNG to power. We hear a lot of terms thrown about: integrated, bundled, unbundled, tolling models, etc. And I wanted to give this some context because as we go through the issues have varying degrees of relevance depending on whether we are talking about an integrated model or whether we are talking about an unbundled structure. So for the purposes of this discussion, when we are talking about a bundled or an integrated structure, what we are really talking about is the same entity doing both the regasification piece as well as the power plant piece. And this could be the same entity doing it, or it could be an entity doing it through subsidiaries. But what is key is that the ownership of the 2 facilities is common. and therefore their operations are synchronized effectively through a common owner. Single financing of an integrated project is an ideal that people aim for, and in theory, that is something which should be easy to achieve. But for reasons we will discuss, simply having an integrated project does not necessarily do away with a number of issues which lenders and banks focus on. The second category of project is an unbundled project. An unbundled project can be further divided into two categories. We have tolling models where the regasification piece is separate from the power plant. They're owned by two separate vehicles. The LNG is procured not by the tolling company, but not by the terminal company or regasification company, but by either an aggregator, for example, the model that we have in Singapore, or by the power company itself. And the aggregator or gasco or the powerco enters into a terminal use agreement with the terminal to convert the LNG into gas. These kind of projects, you would typically finance the regasification and the power piece separately. There may be multiple gas buyers. And the second you split up the financing, there are certain specific issues which need to be considered, which we will walk through as we go through the presentation. The second kind of an unbundled project is a gas sale model. And I have to confess, I do personally struggle with a gas sale model in certain situations. A gas sale model effectively involves separate entities doing the regasification piece and the power infrastructure piece, but assumes that the terminal company purchases the LNG, converts it into gas, and then ultimately sells it to the power company and other consumers. And of course, we are all familiar with models like this. So for example, Petronet in India is a purchaser of LNG and a seller of gas through 3 affiliated Government of India owned undertakings. The reason I have personally always struggled with a gas sale type structure or a pure gas sale structure is because it, in effect, contaminates an infrastructure business, which is the regasification business, with the sale of commodity, which is a completely different business line. And I have always struggled with the idea of taking commodity risk in an infrastructure project, whereas investors and lenders to infrastructure projects want to stay as far away from pure commodity risk as is possible. And of course, if you separate the tolling function from the gas LNG purchase and gas sale function, then really the gas sales model is no different to a tolling model. But for completeness, I wanted to quickly describe these options to you. Last overarching comment before we get into the details of the issues. A lot of us are familiar with gas to power projects, but LNG to power is not the same as a gas to power project or a CCGT. We are talking about qualitatively different levels of complexity. We are talking about larger scales and sizes. We are talking about a significantly enhanced project-on-project risk, which is something that people across the chain which delivers the LNG to power project will focus on. And very fundamentally, gas itself as a commodity and the way in which gas is sold and converted into power doesn't necessarily match the way in which LNG is purchased and ultimately used to generate power in a number of ways. So there are significant distinctions between gas to power and LNG to power. And it's sometimes simplistic to assume that there are large degrees of similarity and therefore really the risk issues are the same. The second general observation I wanted to make was there is very little market practice for LNG to power projects. All too often in negotiations and discussions, we have people talking to about what is market and what is customary or normal. When we look back and think about all the different LNG to power projects that we have been involved in, I think the one key theme that does emerge is actually there is relatively little settled market practice. The third thematic point that I wanted to discuss was flexibility and optionality, which is something that governments and off-takers are so very keen on, and this is understandable, comes at a price and a premium. The more flexibility and optionality there is in a system, the greater the price that is that'll have to be paid for that flexibility and optionality, and that is comes home in very clear terms when we start talking about LNG projects and working out how we introduce flexibility into LNG procurement. Last key thematic point is Africa is a very different market from many other parts of the world. For those of us who have done a lot of work in Africa, I think we recognize that the degree of government involvement in the sector differentiates it from a number of other markets. Forget Europe or North America. Even markets in Latin America are structured very differently to the way in which the power market in most African countries is structured. All of us who work in the energy sector in Africa are all too aware of the situation that a number of off-takers, distributors, transmission companies, bulk purchasers find themselves in from a credit perspective, and the kind of discussions that have to be had on appropriate credit support and a backstop for financial obligations. The third, not uniquely African point, but an important consideration is that the gas market, and this means not just the soft gas market as in a market for gas, but also the physical infrastructure that constitutes a functioning gas market, is relatively underdeveloped in most African countries. And this has significant implications for LNG to power projects in a way in which a coal-fired power project would not be affected. Lastly, currency issues and inadequate structured products which can hedge currencies. In fact, shortage of currencies or the ability to convert into dollars or into an international freely convertible currency, I think, continues to be a concern. And the last point I think that I want to make before we go into the issues is somewhat differently to a number of other countries. There are a number of countries in Africa where there is still a significant need for baseload production. And this again informs LNG procurement in a very material way, because the consequences of setting up a power plant as a peaker or as a mid-merit station and the impact that has on your LNG procurement strategy is quite different to how you would approach LNG procurement for a baseload project. And we will talk about some of those issues over the next few minutes. Right. Moving on from the last comment that I made, the first thematic issue that I'm hoping to discuss is the different kinds of generation profile that you are aiming for. Those of you who are familiar with the power sector understand, of course, the difference between a baseload project, a mid-merit project, and a peaking power plant. It stands to reason that a mid-merit operation or a low or a peaking power plant is not the kind of a project that can support a fixed volume, long-term take-or-pay LNG sale and purchase agreement. In fact, there are question marks about how expensive access to tolling capacity is if it's not going to be used constantly. The setup of the plant has a material impact on fuel strategy. So, long-term LNG SPAs may simply not be viable other than for baseload. However, if you have a low volume LNG supply and you are trying to set up a peaker or a mid-merit operation relying on spot cargoes being available, you not only expose yourself to spot price risk, but more importantly, you expose yourself to actually the cargo being available on a spot basis in the first place. And so the question is, setting up your plant with a clear defined strategy on the kind of profile it is expected to service, because this will inform LNG procurement. This is particularly important for LNG projects because, of course, unlike gas or coal, LNG has this nasty habit of weathering or boiling off or vanishing if stored for extended periods of time and not used. And all of these have cost consequences ultimately for the procurer. The other important factor to keep in mind is that LNG, in most cases, offers relatively limited flexibility to purchasers. It is not uncommon when dealing with gas sale arrangements in Africa to see take or pay under GSAs pegged at 75, but more usually 80 or 85%, perhaps 90% of the adjusted annual contract quantity. This is very different from LNG because LNG, of course, as you're all aware, has take or pay, and more often than not, that take or pay is structured on a 100% basis or on a cargo by cargo basis. The compatibility of that structure with the way in which we understand our baseload plants to work on the continent is something that has to be considered. Similarly, consideration has to be given to the use of backup fuel and the consequences that of using backup fuel if, for example, LNG is not available to convert into gas, and of course reconversion from that backup fuel back into use by gas, where that reconversion process is required. Because of course you can call a plant dual fired, but operators will tell you that it is not as simple as flicking a switch. One last point to make on this is this increasing world of inventory managers and participants who are providing LNG and are willing to provide LNG with greater flexibility than is normally available. You can get flexibility under LNG sale and purchase agreements. You can get downflex rights, etc., which can help reduce the amount of quantity that you're committed to take. But the elections to take those reduced quantities usually have to be made at the beginning of the year, or even if they're permitted to be made intra-year, significantly in advance of when the gas will actually be burnt. This is fundamentally a disconnect with the rapid changes that a plant's dispatch profile can see on a day-to-day basis. So once again, you see a slight disconnect here between standard LNG procurement and the way in which a CCGT runs in any sort of modern grid. Inventory managers are a class of LNG suppliers who are willing to offer enhanced degrees of flexibility to off-takers, but this comes at a price. And this also comes with associated conditions. So for example, exclusive use of terminals, it needs certain conditions to be satisfied, availability of LNG close by so you can rapidly respond to diminishing inventory. And of course, as I mentioned, it doesn't necessarily come as cheap as long-term LNG supply. The second point that I wanted to touch on was the structure of tariff, and this will come as no surprise to a number of you. This is another point on which I've had mixed thoughts. We all recognize that significant capex for large CCGT or onshore regasification terminals will be denominated in US dollars. Now, the South African experience has shown that it is possible to live with that sort of structure by entering into a hedge at the time the EPC contract is entered into to avoid a difference between ultimately the price that has to be paid in US dollars and where the rand finds itself. But of course, an important consideration is that that sort of hedge is not necessarily available for every currency. And even where it is available, for example, in the case of the rand, it is not available for an extended period. Which brings us to the second point. In all of these projects, OPEX, particularly, for example, with FSRUs, the higher, other variable and fixed charges, will be denominated in US dollars. So the question is, how are these going to be paid, given that there is a move generally on the continent to push towards local currency tariffs? In addition to that, add fuel, and the second you step away from the world of coal and you are in the world of LNG, you're talking about a US dollar tariff. So what does this all mean in context of the fact that governments and utilities are pushing IPPs to generate in local currency tariffs. What does it mean in a situation where long-term hedges are simply not available and where the market is worried about currency convertibility or frankly even international currency availability in certain jurisdictions? I think the underlying emotion at the bottom of all of this seems to be a reluctance to dollarize the tariff that is available to consumers in any country. And that is completely understandable. But equally, if you look at the conventional generation profile in most of sub-Saharan Africa, if you think about the HFO, if you think about the LFO, if you think about the diesel, even in a place like South Africa, if you think about Ankerlik and the other peaking stations which frankly run on diesel, they already have dollarized tariff. You may pay for the tariff in local currency, but ultimately it reflects a commodity which has an international dollar price. And so really, have we not already in most countries gotten a high degree of dollarized tariff, particularly outside of South Africa, because of course South Africa has coal, which can be denominated in rand. But if you think about all the HFO, LFO plants which are being used so extensively across the continent, these are all dollarized tariffs in effect. So the implications for LNG to power are quite clear. It doesn't matter if governments and utilities want to push towards local currencies. In the absence of long-term structured products which permit long-term hedging, it is difficult to see how you could avoid a clear reference to dollar currency risk and build into the tariff mechanisms to pass through that risk ultimately to the off-taker. You can think about mitigation mechanics. For example, you can think about more sensitive or nuanced indexations. You can think about price review provisions. You can think about blending long-term pricing with spot purchases. But none of them take away from the essential truth that we are talking about an industry which requires dollars to be paid for fuel and for a number of other expenses. And ultimately, somebody has to take that foreign exchange risk. The third point, thematic issue that we wanted to touch on was the failure to take LNG. As discussed, all of you are aware that LNG contracts are typically concluded on a take-or-pay basis, where if you do not take the LNG you were meant to, you have to pay for it in any event. However, you are either entitled to receive a make-up cargo at some point in the future, which increasingly a broader profile of LNG sellers are trying to resist because it creates operational difficulties for them. Or you have a concept of a mitigation sale, which is where the stranded or the distressed cargo is sold on a reasonable endeavors basis by the LNG supplier and used to lower the take-or-pay liability effectively of the purchaser who failed to take LNG. Now, when we think about an LNG to power project, and this is particularly true where there is no gas grid, there are a range of things that could go wrong. The power purchaser might decide that it cannot dispatch that particular CCGT which is connected to the regasification terminal. There may be a transmission line outage because of which the CCGT cannot be dispatched. There may be a failure or a default because of which the CCGT is not dispatched. There could be a situation where the EPC contractor is late, not by days, but by months and many months because of a critical turbine failure. And how in this situation would an LNG to power project respond to the fact that there is a committed long-term arrangement to secure LNG and at the same time delays and a failure to take, which results in an inability to take LNG? Is there, for example, an ability to pass through the costs to the power procurer where it is clearly the power procurer's fault? Does that pass-through require regulatory sign-off or regulatory intervention? Is there a downstream market to whom, instead of selling a distressed cargo of LNG, gas can be sold to the downstream market. And as I mentioned, in most cases in sub-Saharan Africa, there isn't any such gas market. And while you can go after your EPC contractor for liquidated damages, as we know, there are always caps on what EPC contractors are willing to pay. So there is a question about whether the procurement strategy for an LNG to power project should be de-risked by relying more on short-term supplies as you get closer and closer to commercial operations date, and only then convert into a long-term LNG SPA, or whether there is an argument that a long-term LNG SPA should be committed upfront and completion risk managed the best that can be through a combination of liquidated damages, pass-through items for the power purchaser, but also things like potentially business interruption insurance, ability to divert cargoes, ability to direct waste gas to a downstream market, etc. Again, no one answer, but all important considerations, including whether the best LNG to power project in a which is a first of a kind project, is perhaps structured without committing the LNG upfront, but instead simply putting the regasification piece in first, relying on spot purchases, and then after completion moving into a more long-term arrangement. The next point I wanted to quickly discuss was financing. And in terms of financing, draw the distinction really between an integrated model and an unbundled model. Now, clearly, intuitively, an integrated project should be simpler to finance. But it is interesting because I don't think there is a universe of examples out there of a combined financing of an FSRU plus a pipeline plus a CCGT, etc. I think the number of examples is relatively modest. And that's because the kind of lenders who would lend for the construction of an FSRU are sometimes different to the kind of lenders who would lend for a CCGT. Equally, lenders who lend to a CCGT would not have to fund the construction of an FSRU because that would be chartered in. But the presence of multiple lenders on one side of the FSRU and on the other side of the CCGT does present challenges. So, for example, there is a question mark about whether the fuel supplier and the owner of the ship and their lenders have a right to proceeds in the CCGT companies or the borrower's waterfall as they trickle through and before distributions are made to the shareholders of the power company. If they do, what kind of priority right do they have? Do they have a priority right only pre-enforcement, in the pre-enforcement waterfall? Or is it the case that there is a legitimate case to be made for a charter party receiving certain specified payments, or for a fuel supplier receiving certain payments in a post-enforcement waterfall as well? These are all questions that immediately start arising the second you have different groups of lenders who are essentially invested into the same project on two separate ends, like with an FSRU and a CCGT. The other key points that I think are interesting perhaps, and more so in LNG to power projects than a simple gas to power project, are the kinds of direct agreements that you would expect to see. Now, we are familiar with lender direct agreements, step-in rights, substitution rights, etc. But a number of LNG to power projects, or frankly even regasification projects with supply to a broad distribution of downstream customers, actually have contractual direct agreements. And these are designed to insulate the structure from the insolvency of a single market participant. So for example, imagine you have an aggregator who is purchasing LNG, having it converted into gas, and then selling gas to downstream customers. It would be catastrophic for this market if the aggregator was to go insolvent. So to deal with this issue and to mitigate the risk which arises out of the insolvency of the aggregator, you have a series of backup direct contractual agreements which take the relationship that existed between the terminal and the LNG supplier and the aggregator and its downstream customers for gas, and automatically, in the case of an insolvency, knock the aggregator out, but snap into place so that they maintain the contractual integrity and permit the continued physical flow of gas from the terminal through to the ultimate consumer of gas. So these contractual direct agreements increasingly play a role in a number of LNG to power projects. In addition to this, because we are talking about vessels and we are talking about different pools of lenders, the other kind of direct agreements which you would not see in a gas to power project or a conventional plant are quiet enjoyment undertakings or non-disturbance undertakings, which you would try and secure from stakeholders who are involved with the FSRU, for example, on the basis that even if something goes wrong with the shipbuilding company, or if something goes wrong with the ship owner, that the charter is maintained as long as charter payments continue to be paid, and the charter's lenders don't take enforcement action, because of course that would result in the FSRU floating away and there being no LNG. The next point we wanted to very quickly touch on is change in law. Now, for those of us who do a lot of work in sub-Saharan Africa, I think it is a fact of our working lives that we hear the change in law discussion more often than we would like to. Now, this is understandable. I think there are relatively few projects which have been successfully closed financially, which do not benefit from some kind of change in law, change in tax type protection across Africa. And I think when we are thinking about LNG to power projects, suddenly the kind of protection that is required from a change in law or change in law tax perspective needs to be considered more broadly. So for example, this is not just about a change in tax or a change in law that impacts the power plant or the pipeline company or the regasification company, but potentially also entities like an aggregator or entities like an LNG supplier when they bring the LNG on shore, for example, to supply into the regasification terminal. So how is the change in law or change in tax impact across all of these different entities ultimately borne by whichever entity has agreed to take or assume that risk? More often than not, the government. And so you need to enter into a particularly sophisticated set of pass-through provisions to pass through the impact of change in law or change in tax from the LNG supplier to the gas purchaser or the aggregator through the tolling company back all to the power purchaser, who ultimately, or the CCGT, who will try to pass it on in turn either through the power purchase agreement or through the government support agreement, whatever shape that takes. What is key here is defining the way in which that change in law protection works, because the idea of having 6, 7 different market participants each do their separate government support or state support or equivalent agreement is not appealing. Therefore, the need to ensure a very effective pass-through through different contracts. A quick few minutes on third-party risks. I think the point here quite simply is that complex projects with multiple stakeholders present special challenges. And while it is always the case that a CCGT would take responsibility for its own suppliers and contractors, if an LNG to power project is structured on the basis of a parastatal's involvement, example, regasification facility is owned by the government or a government company, or there is a mandatory requirement to sell gas to third parties or to provide third-party access, or there is a requirement to deal with a private entity which has been identified and is running the regasification terminal. These are natural monopolies. And if a CCGT is forced to deal with them, I think the question that will arise is who really takes responsibility for the default or failure of these forced partners, and what are the consequences of default by them? So certainly taking risk on an unfettered basis when state actors are involved or when third parties are contractually imposed on the structure, it's something that a lot of CCGTs or power companies and the lenders would find difficult. And so they would look to see if that risk can be passed through. But if for any reason it can't, they would look for very strong regulatory oversight and control over the kind of arrangements that are entered into, and on policing those arrangements. For example, if a private power company was forced to contract with a pre-identified private regasification company, what are the terms of tolling? Who's going to police those terms? And you would need exceedingly strong regulatory oversight in the absence of agreement. The next point we wanted to touch upon was the ancillary failure issue, and we've all seen projects where the off-taker, be it government or be it private, has agreed to take on the risk of and responsibility for building ancillary infrastructure. Take, for example, a transmission line, and the transmission line was delayed. So the question, of course, is who takes that risk, and typically the person who was responsible to put the ancillary facilities into place takes responsibility. Just to make the point that the second we enter the world of LNG to power, we are actually talking about so much more than just the transmission line. And we are potentially talking about not just the gas transmission pipeline, but we are also talking about the regasification facility. We are talking about access to the port. We are talking about the ability for LNG carriers to come in and unload their cargoes as and when they have been scheduled. And so the degree of the number of ancillary facilities which are critical to ensuring that the project succeeds increases, and we need to consider all of these associated facilities as well. I think it goes without saying, and there is a good argument that this should have come much earlier, is that major projects in sub-Saharan Africa continue to require sovereign support. And this is a threshold issue for a number of investors and lenders, with very few exceptions. And of course, this is an increasing issue for most governments in the region for reasons we are all aware of, whether it's IMF, whether it's their balance sheets, whether it's their contingent liability position. Now, government support, of course, takes many different forms: GCSAs, put call option agreements, state support, implementation agreements, letters of support, which are sometimes more than just letters. And the fundamental premise is always that the government will pay if the off-taker does not. And if ultimately there is a complete failure and a termination payment is due, the government backstops that as well, or agrees that it undertakes to keep the off-taker solvent, thereby indirectly offering assurances that the payment will be made. When you apply the government support requirement to the LNG to power chain, this suddenly is not just about the CCGT. It is also about an infrastructure facility like the regasification facility. And if the CCGT was an anchor customer, without the CCGT, there may be relatively limited use for the terminal use agreement. So does the terminal also benefit from some sort of sovereign support? Or does that sovereign support flow through the CCGT to the regasification facility? What about the LNG supplier? Does the LNG supplier get compensated in a situation where the project terminates because of, let us say, off-taker failure? And if the LNG supplier is compensated, to what degree? It is not, for example, inevitably the case that every LNG SPA has a termination amount and permits parties to walk away by paying a certain termination amount. So how would the market take or perceive the risk of there being a termination? What would it need to see in the sovereign support to give comfort that at the end of the day, there will be some compensation after debt and equity is repaid for fuel suppliers or for terminal providers? And you can now immediately see why fuel suppliers and terminal providers are so interested in understanding where they stand in a pre- and post-enforcement waterfall of a project company, to try and make sure that they grab some money if things start going wrong. Um, the next point I wanted to touch upon is a very lawyerly point, but I think one that we have seen used repeatedly and one that is exceedingly helpful, I think, for parties to get comfortable with the wide array of agreements that you'd expect to see on an LNG to power project. I mean, in excess of 15, 20, 30 sometimes, if you have multiple shippers, users, and LNG suppliers. Breach or failure at any point of the segment could have a cascading effect and incredible impact on all other parties in the chain. But the consequences of a mismatch when there is a dispute are particularly significant. Take, for example, two separate arbitral tribunals coming to diametrically opposite determinations on the same set of facts under two related contracts, which would in effect squeeze the party in the middle, potentially all the way to insolvency. So how do you reduce the risk of an arbitral misalignment? Or how do you reduce the risk of there being this gap between disputes under different contracts? And what we have seen and what we have done in a number of cases is put into place an umbrella expert resolution and an umbrella arbitration provision where different parties sign up to the same principles of expert resolution, dispute resolution, and it is understood that disputes determined under that procedure will ultimately bind all parties for the purposes of all contracts. This is not to say that this is a fantastic system with no concerns at all. Concerns have been expressed, some of them legitimate, including disenfranchisement of people who are late in raising their dispute, including groups of respondents or litigants being prejudiced because of the way in which the umbrella arbitration is structured. There are issues around differentiating between multi-party disputes and disputes which are really, truly bilateral. But these disadvantages and concerns notwithstanding, I think it is fair to say that umbrella arbitration and expert resolution is an interesting concept which you must consider if you're doing an LNG to power project. I think the last slide I have, and I'll touch upon this very quickly before we move on to questions. Please do send through questions or comments. I've received some, but if there are any others, please do send them in now. As you are all aware, local content continues to be hugely important for sub-Saharan Africa. And there is a focus not just on local content, but also on local participation. There is an emphasis on capacity building, on economic participation, but also, interestingly, when it comes to LNG, development of the local gas market. Now, this needs to be considered and thought about in a fair bit of detail because imposing local content requirements across the entire value chain does have serious implications. Imposing equity participation across the value chain again has serious implications. Where is the money coming from? Do the local participants have access to enough liquidity to be able to fund their participation? But more importantly, are they able to respond with things like completion guarantees or sponsor support? Because in a number of these projects, it would not be unusual for lenders to ask for some sort of sponsor support or completion guarantee to paper over the interface risk or to paper over the gap risk in terms of timing, because, of course, certain parts of the project have a very long lead time and others don't. So how would local content participants be able to fund their participation and indeed completion guarantees or sponsor support in these situations? And insofar as third-party access to markets is concerned, while this is a fantastic, and I think it is an objective which one would hope people aim for, I think it is also true that the potential requirement to oversize capacity is very challenging because who pays for that oversized capacity? Who takes market development risk? And one could say that the investor takes market development risk, but you can bet that you'll be paying for that a premium as the investor tries to develop the market and takes on that risk. So, I mean, that brings me to the end of the few themes that we wanted to discuss. I'd very much like to spend a few minutes discussing some of the questions that we've received. And if you do have any more questions, please do send them through. We are getting them on a computer over here. So the first question really is the legal framework in Africa generally considered to be sustainable and respect legal certainty, taking into account that big LNG projects are quite often being disruptive due to changes of legal environment or government? And I think our response to this would be actually Africa has seen massive project financings. And I think there is a recognition that the market still is getting to grips with certain frameworks in providing certain degrees of investor certainty. But I think it is fair to say that there are a number of really large, complex project financings that have closed in Africa and are successful projects in doing well. I think it is also fair to say that these projects have mechanisms to deal with things like regulatory or legal changes. It's very interesting. If you look at Moody's report on project finance deals, I think from a few years back, the rate of default in Africa was perhaps the lowest across all regions. Now, this could be because it's a self-selecting pool. People are more careful with structuring their projects. It is also harder to perhaps enforce, or there's a perception that it is harder to enforce in Africa. But the fact of the matter is, you have a number of projects, you have relatively low workouts, and that is possibly down to the fact that these are carefully structured in the first place. The second question that we've received is best way in which a GenCo can structure an IPP project with numerous corporate off-takers and a DISCO in a way that limits the risk of non-payment to the GenCo. We are, of course, familiar with power plants and projects where the power that is generated is sold either on a captive basis or to a number of consumers, all in the private sector, and that de-risks the project from an off-taker credit perspective. Yes, absolutely, we are familiar with these projects. However, I am not familiar with any LNG to power projects of meaningful size or utility scale that have been concluded on this basis. I do know that there has been a move to do smaller projects with containerized LNG being fuel and the power plant in question providing power to an industrial park, etc. But I am not familiar with large utility scale examples of this kind of a project. The next question that we've received is, on the power side, do we think that there is a concern in relation to excess capacity, which presents a risk that the cost of electricity will be very high on a levelized basis? And have we seen any PPA innovations to help utilities manage this risk? Well, I haven't in the markets in which I have, which we've been talking about. I think the fact of the matter is, this goes back to a point that I made previously. If you want optionality or flexibility, ultimately somebody is paying for it. At the end of the day, if there is the requirement for generation, irrespective of whether that generation is used or not, unless you have concluded or done the plant on a merchant basis, somebody is paying for it. And that will increase the cost of electricity even if the plant is not used. So I'm not aware of any particular legal technology, for lack of a better expression, which can help solve the problem of not paying for something that you receive. So on that note, I would suggest that ultimately, if generation capacity is required, unless you have managed to convince somebody to do it on a merchant basis, it will need to be paid for. We also here have a question which says, who are the main off-takers and how bankable are these PPAs? I think the answer is there are any number of bankable PPAs on the continent. The bigger question is, will we be able to secure that in context of a truly financed standalone LNG to power project, given some of the complexity that we've described during the course of this presentation? I don't know. I think it is fair to say that the main off-takers, setting aside the idea of an industrial park or captive consumers, which we've just discussed, the main off-takers are distribution, transmission utilities, or bulk purchasers. In most countries in the region, they face challenges from a credit perspective, from a solvency perspective. And in order to make those PPAs bankable, therefore, not only do they need to be properly structured, taking into account a number of the items that we discussed, but as indicated, there needs to be some sort of credit support, usually by way of a sovereign backstop, before investors and lenders get comfortable. There are, to my mind, very few projects which have successfully closed in the absence of that kind of sovereign support. And where they did so close, the general market perception was that the off-taker was in a good credit position with a good payment record stretching back over a decade and no known defaults. And I think even in that case, a letter of support was required of some kind. I'm just checking to see how we're doing on time. We have a few more minutes, so I can take a few more questions. The next question is, what scale do we think is important or the minimum for LNG to power? This is actually a difficult question to answer, not least because I'm a lawyer. But and this is something that the smart commercial minds around the room and people in the business would be able to give more feedback on. But I think the question is difficult for a number of reasons. One is we don't know what context this project is developed in. So, for example, you could have a very small or even a non-existent power plant, but you could have a robust gas grid and downstream market with 6 or 7 or 8 or 10 industrial customers, cement plants, kilns, etc., who are willing to take the gas. Suddenly, that would reduce the pressure on your CCGT acting as an anchor client for the regasification unit. If you do have a CCGT as an anchor plant for a regasification unit, then it really depends on the size of your regasification facility, the kind of storage you have. It depends on whether the terminal in question or the FSRU indeed in question is being used for reloads or being used for LNG bunkering in addition to just supplying LNG and gas to the CCGT. So there are a number of factors. And we are all familiar with the standard sizes of FSRUs. We are aware of FRUs, which have a range of storage options. We are also familiar with the fact that onshore regasification terminals can range from really small and modest to giant 5, 10 MMTPA type facilities. So I think my answer to this would be that technology is permitting smaller and smaller regasification projects all the time. We have clients who are actually thinking of doing containerized LNG-based power plants. So you could probably have something which was quite small, but in order to make it sustainable, you would need to consider all of these different factors and see whether that is workable. The next point, the next question which has been raised is unbundled versus bundled project finance procurement. What are the minimum gas volumes to have a bankable project, and what LNG indexation should be used in South Africa? I mean, we've already touched upon minimum gas volumes, but let's talk about LNG indexation in South Africa. I know that NERSA has a particular view on how it would like gas to be priced, and it talks about a basket. There were several approaches that were being considered. But stepping away from the approach in particular in South Africa, if you look at the international market, all of us are aware that LNG has historically been priced on the basis of some sort of a link to oil price. We are familiar with S curves and the way in which those are applied in context of LNG sale and purchase agreements. We are also aware that the link to crude can be expressed as a function of Brent. It can be expressed as a function of JCC. we are now aware that increasingly LNG SPAs also refer to gas indices in order to give you a price. So, for example, American LNG and the reference to Henry Hub plus some sort of a margin on top to reflect liquefaction, regasification costs, liquefaction and tolling costs at terminals on the eastern seaboard. We are aware that a long time back, historically, when India and China were first opening up to LNG, they got away with terms which were never seen again. So, for example, the Indians managed to procure LNG on a fixed pricing basis for a number of years. The Chinese consumers referred to the fact that their gas markets needed to develop, were not sophisticated, and ended up negotiating caps with reference to the price of coal because they said that is the true substitute. I think it is fair to say that it is relatively unusual to see those kinds of pricing structures outside of bespoke government-to-government deals, if that. I think the market is in a place where it looks at crude prices or it looks at gas prices to determine the price of LNG. It is certainly open to South Africa when it does its tender process and invites bids to ask for bids to require that LNG supply is structured on the basis of a particular index. I think one has to be careful if that index ceases to reflect what the market is used to, because you may find LNG suppliers who are willing to work on the back of an exotic coal-based index, but they would almost certainly look to hedge their exposure in a particular way. They would certainly look to price in some sort of a premium, and it is possible that a number of them who are used to selling on the basis of a link to crude or gas may be discouraged from participating in a very prescriptive framework, which, for example, says 50% has to be linked to a particular coal index, 25% has to be linked to another particular unrelated index, not being crude, not being gas. So I think one needs to be careful there. There is an interesting subtext to this question, which is what is the viability of LNG bunkering and offloading to smaller vessels? So this is interesting. One, LNG bunkering, as you know, is increasingly an area of focus for a number of projects. In fact, when we think about a gas market or we think about an LNG market, we think about CCGTs, we think about industrial consumers. Actually, bunkering, LNG bunkering, or in fact reloading LNG on LNG vessels to distribute locally in the local market, is something that is increasingly discussed in context of a number of projects. And it would not be surprising if an LNG bunkering business or a reloading business became a core part of the business case for many regasification terminals. So it is certainly a very interesting concept. I have got a few more questions, but I'm afraid we are almost out of time. We have questions here on Nigeria LNG to power. We have questions on ESG principles and HR risks. We have questions in relation to projects in particular countries. We have broad questions around how the government and ESCOM can introduce the gas to power project in RSA, mitigating LNG procurement risk. Some of these points I'm hoping we did touch upon in terms of a strategy, the difficulty with getting long-term LNG, but equally the strategy that could be adopted to de-risk things like delays or things like interface risks at the beginning. We hope that this sort of discussion was useful. It's always a little difficult speaking to a camera and not being in a room where people can engage with you. But thank you for the questions. They were very helpful, and I'm hoping added an element of interaction to this discussion. If you have any follow-up questions or would like to discuss anything in more detail, please feel free to send us an email, give us a call, or get in touch. We look forward to hearing from you. It's always a really interesting topic. Thank you very much. Have a good day.